In this tutorial, we will be taking a quick look at how to incorporate a transfer point into your network. A transfer point can be modeled in the system where there's a change in the method of material transportation. In this case, our network is comprised of pipeline line fill, and we will be adding a marine transfer point at the beginning of our network and a rail transfer point at the end of our network. So first, let's start with a marine transfer point, where we will open our Components menu, select the transfer point, click once, and click again to place on the canvas, where we will double-click on the component icon to open up the Properties tab, and let's give it a name of Marine Port. In the Configuration menu, we'll select the custody transfer point type of marine, since we're putting a marine port, and you'll notice that we have the other options for rail and road, but we'll get to those later. The number of platforms correspond to the number of inflow or outflows you wish to have linked to the transfer point. In this case, we're only going to link the marine port to feeder 1, so we'll leave the platform's value at 1. Risers per platform indicate the number of containers from the transport type that can be loaded or unloaded simultaneously. This will depend on the number of containers that we design our transport type with, so for now, we'll leave it at 1. We can also have some inbound constraints for the marine port, such as only allowing certain transport types, commodities, pools, and shippers. But again, let's leave that alone for now. So now that we've squared that away, we now want to go to the properties of the inflow that we wish to connect our transfer point to, which will be feeder 1. And inside the Configuration tab, we can select a custody transfer point, which will be our newly created marine port. So now that we've done that, let's save and move into the Configuration tab, where we'll go to the Components tab, and the first thing we'll do is create a transport type. So we'll have a new folder, we'll call it Watercraft, and we'll add a new transport carrier of a tanker ship. So the transport mode that you see in the transport type menu has to match the custody transfer point type in the transfer point menu. So in this case, it's going to be marine. Storage units. Let's say that our tanker ship has 2 storage units, each of a capacity of 200,000 barrels. So that way we have a tanker ship with the total capacity of 400,000 barrels. And we'll enable share platforms, so that way both storage units can be unloaded at the same platform, if that platform has the capacity. Our tank will allow multiple commodities, so we're not going to have any constraints on the commodities, pools, or shippers. For flow configuration, we'll enable the loading rate limit and unloading rate limit, where we'll set a maximum loading rate of 2,000 barrels per hour and an unloading rate limit of 1,500 barrels per hour. There are some more advanced options you can use to customize your transport type, such as the Advanced menu and the Setup Times menu, but for now we'll leave them as their default settings. So now that we've finished setting up our transport type, let's go up to our nomination plan, where we will then change our nomination details, so that way our source is no longer our inflow, but now it's going to be our newly created transfer point of our marine port. And we'll also select the custom transport of our transport type, which is our tanker ship. Now, since the primary objective for this transfer point is to offload all of the material from the ship to the mainland pipeline as quickly as possible, we should give it an intermediate destination in case final destination 1 is preoccupied and we don't have the ability to send material there. So for delivery 1, let's choose the intermediate destination of tank number 1. And we'll do something similar for delivery number 2, where the source will now be the marine port. The custom transport is going to be our tanker ship, and the intermediate destination, we'll have it go to tank number 2. So now that we've set up our nomination details, let's return to our canvas, go to our transfer point, where we'll change the risers per platform from 1 to 2, since our transport type has 2 containers on it. So that way both containers can be unloaded at the same time. So let's save our model and run it in the standalone engine. So as expected, delivery number 1 is being transported from the marine port via ship to feeder 1, where it then supplies the rest of the supply chain, which it's stopping at its intermediate destination of tank number 1. And we can see the progress of that delivery either here at the feeder 1 side of being loaded, or if we go into the marine port component, we can see the unloading process. And if I speed up the simulation, once it completes, you'll see the depart setup and the arrive setup queues before it starts unloading again, and which would have been for our second nomination of delivery number 2 being delivered to tank number 2 before it moves on to final destination 2. Another configuration example for the transfer point is to connect it to an outflow. So in this case, we have a rail yard transfer point that connects the pipeline infrastructure to a rail system. So going into the rail yard component, we can see the configuration, the custody transfer point type is rail, and we have it connected to 2 platforms. One for final destination 1 and final destination 2. They're both configured so that way their custody transfer point is the rail yard. Now connecting the pipeline infrastructure to the rail infrastructure, I've created a transport type of a train that has 4 storage units on it, each with a capacity of 10,000 barrels. And now going to the nomination plan, we've configured the nominations so that the transport type is our new train, the source is the feeder, but the destination is now the transfer point of our rail yard, with an intermediate destination of a tank. So looking at this example in the standalone engine, we have 2 continuous streams of material coming from feeder 1 and feeder 2, both feeding into the final destinations to be sent to the rail yard. And if we look at the rail yard, we can see that it loads from 2 platforms simultaneously. Final destination 1 and final destination 2. And you can see the progress of each of those nominations here.